I work in the Animal Health and Welfare Policy Division in DAERA and Veterinary Service Animal Health Group under the Chief Vet, Brian Durr. And we're very glad and very happy to be facilitating this webinar this evening on Bluetongue and specifically Bluetongue 3. First of all, maybe just set out a little bit of housekeeping. Recording has just started, and thanks Kathy and colleagues in my team for organising today. So there will be a recording made of this presentation and it'll be available on the DAERA website. As such, if I have to say that if I see any AI tools that are recording in the attendee list, I will kick them out. DAERA hasn't formed a position yet on AI tools within meetings, and until that stage, then they will be removed from the meeting. But yes, the recording will be available afterwards. We're going to talk a little bit about BTV3 tonight. We're going to look at the GB experience, and I'm very thankful and very appreciative of GB colleagues joining us. I will introduce them shortly, taking time out of what's a very busy period for them with both Bluetongue and HiPath AI to come and speak this night and share their experience. Though I would encourage questions. Please ask as many questions in the Q&A. We will try to get to as many as we can tonight. We'll try and cover a number of themes in the questions. I can predict what some of those themes might be already, but I'm very happy to take all questions. Those questions that we don't get to tonight, and even the ones that we do get to, we will take them away. We will draft up answers and we will publish it on the DAERA website, but also share it with people who have registered for this event. You'll note that your cameras and mics are turned off. It's not because I don't like engagement. Anyone knows me, I do like engagement, but it's just to manage the webinar, and please engage through the Q&A as you can. A little bit of context as well, I suppose, around Bluetongue, and particularly in Northern Ireland. Bluetongue is now a Category C disease under the Animal Health Law. So that means it's optional eradication. It's very different from a Category A disease, which we have dealt with previously in the past. And Bluetongue was what would have been a Category A disease in the past, and that was mandatory eradication. So, for example, HiPath AI, African swine fever, and foot and mouth disease. The reason I'm drawing that distinction now at the start is Category A diseases under the Animal Health Law have very defined actions and response. There's quite a bit of legislation, and it's very definitive in what we need to do as a competent authority. However, as Bluetongue is now classified as a Category C disease, it's for the competent authority, that's DAERA, to determine what steps we would take. So we have been working closely with stakeholders for many months now on this, and right back to when our colleagues in GB first experienced Bluetongue, and our APHA colleagues will set out a bit of a timeline that. But we've been working with the UFU, the vet associations, and many other representative organisations on what our approach would be should Bluetongue come to Northern Ireland. And we've set that out in a Bluetongue disease control response, and we're going to touch on that at a high level. That's been published since June, and it's available on the DAERA website. The disease control framework, as I say, has been published. We'll also talk a little bit about our approach to vaccination in Northern Ireland. What I would say is that, and the Chief Vet, Brian, doesn't like me saying this that often, but this disease, particularly as it's a Category C disease, and the nature of the disease, it very much depends. Our response will very much depend on the circumstances that we find ourselves in when this disease is first detected. And I think GB colleagues will reflect on that as well too, and about how flexible and adaptable you have to be in your approach. And that flexibility and adaptability and approach can only be in conjunction with yourselves. Livestock keepers and herd keepers, veterinary associations, the Ulster Farmers Union, and other representative organisations. And I want to thank all those organisations for their contributions so far and their support in bringing forward our initial steps. But it's very much our initial steps, and it will very much depend on what the epidemiology tells us and what circumstances that we find ourselves in. So that's just setting a little bit of context. I have mentioned our APHA colleagues, and I'll ask Christina to start sharing her slides now, but I'd like to take this opportunity to thank APHA colleagues, Christina has joined us. Christina Reyes, who's a veterinary advisor for APHA and the field deputy team, outbreak response and contingency planning, and she's been heavily involved in the BTV related activity in the last couple of years. Also, Pilar Romeo has joined us and as a veterinary advisor in APHA in epi risk, and has also been involved in the BTV activity. And then Richard Heppel, who brings experience not only from the most recent outbreaks, but also from BTV 8 during 2007 and 8, right up until the conclusion of that incursion. So we're very grateful to have our colleagues here. I will hand over to them first to take us through their presentation. We're going to cover a little bit about Bluetongue and Bluetongue 3 in particular, and also their experience in dealing with it over the last couple of years. So thanks very much, Christina.
Thanks, Jim. Can you see my screen and can you hear me okay?
Yes, to both. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting us to speak about the Bluetongue story in GB so far. So over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll take you through a back to basics overview of Bluetongue, the current situation in Europe and GB, and what we've been doing in terms of disease control. As Jim have said, we've been quite flexible on the actions that we were taking. So BTV3 background, so historically Bluetongue has been confined to tropical and subtropical areas, but climate change and trade patterns have seen increasing outbreaks in northern regions in recent years. So let's start with back to basics and a bit about the virus. So essentially the Bluetongue virus is an arthropod-borne virus transmitted by biting insects, midges. So it's an orbivirus, and Bluetongue was first described as a clinical entity about 150 years ago, so quite a long time since we first knew about this virus. So the virus can reassort easily because it's got a segmented genome or genetic material, as you can see in blue in the picture. So that's the reason why many new strains emerge so rapidly. So it's got a highly variable surface coat, the one that you can see in green in the picture, and different combinations of these VP2 proteins in the green and the yellow square in there determine the serotypes. So in total, there are around 29 serotypes, so the ones that you can see listed in the picture on the right. And there is little to no cross protection to all the serotypes in recovered animals. So in effect, we could potentially have 29 different diseases. So in the picture on the right, we can see the different serotypes and how they relate to each other. So the thicker the line, so the more related they are. And also in the red circles, you can see the serotypes that have been found in Europe over the recent years. In terms of transmission, Bluetongue virus is mainly spread by culicoides biting midges. So you all know that. That's not something that I'm telling you tonight. But for a midge to be able to transmit the disease, it has to become competent. And this is a really important concept. And the first step for the midge to become competent is to have a blood meal. So if you were a midge and you, what would you pick to feed on, cattle or sheep? So midges feed on anything if they don't have an option, but if they can choose, it seems that they're quite clever and they're rather feeding on cattle, given that there is a much easier access to blood vessels and bigger blood vessels, and it's not so much of a fluffy coat where they might not be able to escape from. In terms of the culicoides biting midge, what else do we need to know about these lead things? So we have mentioned that competence is the ability to transmit disease, but for that, after a midge has taken a blood meal, you need an extrinsic incubation period, so the cycle in the midge, to be completed. So a reminder that the extrinsic incubation period is the time from when a midge bites an infected host until it becomes competent to transmit the virus. So this is crucial. This period depends on temperature So the warmer it is, the faster the cycle completes. But if the temperature is too high, the midges will collapse very quickly as well. So there is a balance in everything. So important to note that replication in the midge won't occur below 13 degrees, but midges will still be biting and active down to 4 degrees, but replication won't happen at that temperature. So for you to have an idea, you need 26 days with an average daily temperature of 15 degrees for a cycle to complete. But having into account that a midge lives an average of 2 to 3 weeks, it could be only a few days if a car or a predator gets on the way, or it could be a couple of months with the right conditions, and especially in the cooler months in the winter. And all is needed for the cycle to complete. You all will be in agreement with me that transmission from infected host to midges is not efficient at all. But however, if the cycle completes, then the midge is competent to transmit disease for its entire life, and a single midge bite can transmit the virus. So quite a big thing there. A couple of more interesting facts about midges is that large numbers might feed on a single animal during a single night. In fact, there are experiments that show that 5,000 bites an hour in cattle. And also, you'd be interesting to know that there are also studies that have shown that the maximum between farm dispersal is around 3 kilometers. So finally, just to mention that midges are believed to survive in the winter as larvae instead of adults. And in here, we've got the whole cycle. We have got an infected viremic animal in there, bitten by a naive vector. It's the female culicoides that need to take a blood meal in order to then lay eggs. So they feed, taking a dose of virus, and then for the cycle to continue, the next step is the completion of the extrinsic incubation period that we have set, and then biting as a susceptible host, and then the cycle which will become infected after a few days, and then the cycle starts again. So other less likely transmission routes are possible, and we have seen them. So are transplacental transmission from the dam to the unborn offspring, which in the uterus, transmission by germinal products, so semen and embryos are a possibility. In fact, the use of frozen semen was deemed to be the most likely reason for reintroduction of Bluetongue 8 in France back in 2015. Other possible routes, transfer of infected blood between animals is also possible, so shared use of needles or surgical interventions without proper cleansing and disinfection of equipment in between the times, and very rarely, but also possible, via the oral route. So it has been reported infection in dogs due to the ingestion of contaminated placenta or birthing fluids. As we all know, the virus can spread long distances by wind dispersal of infected biting midges, and also through the import of or movement of affected animals and their germoplasm. In terms of the disease, it's primarily a disease that affects cattle and sheep, but other domestic species, goats, deer, buffalo, camelids can also be affected, as well as wild ruminants. Important to note that the virus has a predilection for the endothelial cells of the blood vessels, and so causing vasculitis, and that will account for a lot of the clinical signs that we see, such as the hyperemia, erosions, and swelling. In cattle and goats, generally but not always, it tends to be less severe than in sheep, where it can be quite severe. And again, of importance is the fact that cattle can act as reservoirs and amplify the virus to pass on to further vectors. Outbreaks tend to be in the summer and autumn, so the peak of the outbreak, when the peak midge population occur. But as we have said, there could be different diseases depending on the serotype, and they can vary from no clinical signs of and then to animals dying from it. over to Pilar to talk to you about the BTV3 situation in Europe.
Thank you, Christina. As you can see, this is a far cry from where we were only 2 years ago. And when it was first detected in the Netherlands, we immediately looked at Italy, but we since have learned that it was genetically distinct from that virus, and we still don't know where it came from. Next slide, please. So the first confirmed case was detected in the central part of the Netherlands near the airport on the 3rd of September. And by the end of 2023, 5,396 farms had been confirmed. Next slide, please. Things were to get worse in 2024, but there was some hope arising from the first emergency permission to use the vaccines, 3 vaccines for BTV3 in May. However, by mid-June, they had reported the first 2 cases of that season. This time, even areas that were not affected in the first season were so in the second one. And there was including a report of BTV12 in October. By the end of 2024, in spite of a huge effort on vaccination, where between 70 and 80 sheep farms and around 45% of cattle farms are reported to have vaccinated, 8,527 farms had confirmed disease. And by October 2024, sheep population had decreased by 20%. However, although the vaccines were not able to prevent transmission, it is recognized that there was a positive effect in reducing mortality and reducing clinical signs. And our colleagues have been able to demonstrate that statistically. So not working as well as hoped, but it has had some effect. So far, no cases have been detected in 2025. They have changed their surveillance procedures. So the early detection in the first 2 seasons was based on submission of samples from clinically affected suspect animals, plus the report case procedures. This year, there's just going to be a round of surveillance in July, where up to 14 farms with clinical signs in each of the 20 regions of the Netherlands were submitted by collaborating practices. But of course, still statutory notifiable disease. In terms of what is the situation, as I said, no cases reported this season in the Netherlands. Germany has reported 146, France 1,117, and Denmark 10. I must say that we have now, regretfully, not 9, but 12 cases as of today. There are some countries that stopped reporting last year, so we are unsure about the situation, like Belgium. It seems that we may be following the Netherlands, 1 season behind. That's the opinion of some consultants. Certainly, things are not looking great, where we have to add to the risk of incursions. The 12 cases that we have are not linked to incursions. The virus seemed to have created cases from existing infected midges in the country. Next slide, please. I will now hand you back to Christina for the clinical picture.
Back to me for the clinical picture in the EU, and we are going to cover mainly the clinical picture in the Netherlands because it's the country for which we have more info, as they have shared a lot of information and we are in close contact with them. But a similar picture has been reported in other European countries. So as you can see, the picture with the Bluetongue, just a reminder that Bluetongue as a result of cyanosis is rare and we don't tend to see that clinical sign. In fact, that picture is from an experiment on the lab, Perbright lab. So in the Netherlands, sheep infected with Bluetongue 3 showed severe clinical signs. So as you can see in the pictures, so mouth lesions, lameness, look at the detached hoof in there, hypersalivation, nasal discharge, lethargy, and ram infertility. Those were the main signs reported. Mortality, as Pilar has mentioned, was staggering. Over 50,000 sheep died by the end of 2023 and more than 65,000 by the end of 2024. So that's nearly 20% of the national flock. So this impact is anything but marginal. So it's worth noting that a concurrent mongoose outbreak might have exacerbated the situation, and that's why they have documented that that was going on as well at the same time as Bluetongue in some cases. So for those sheep that survived Bluetongue virus, the recovery was slow and took even months in some cases. In the cattle showed similar signs to the sheep, but we also had other consequences, such as, for example, a drop in milk production, so of around 1.5 liters per cow per day, which translates into roughly 8,000 liters lost per lactation. So that's a serious hit to the dairy sector. Reproductive issues were also reported, including abortions and dummy calves, likely linked to transplacental infection. There were a lot of losses in the cattle sector as well, so nearly 10,000 cattle died in 2023 and over 13,000 cattle died in 2024. Back to Pilar to talk to you about BTV3 in GB.
Yeah, so except for this season, the previous 2 seasons of BTV3 as well as the BTV8 outbreak were linked to incursions from the near continent. And you can see this map courtesy of the Met Office of the source locations. This is just an example of how plumes can go across carrying midges as particles. So this just tells you whether there was a wind plume that was competent to carry the midges across, not whether the midges were infected, but you can see how different sources will target different counties more frequently. Next slide, please. In terms of the 2023-2024, luckily we got the first incursions confirmed in November. So the high transmission season was over by then. The tracing window was set up as the 1st of September, and we ended up having 65 cases with 126 positive animals, the vast majority cattle, but restricted to 4 counties. So the 2 counties where disease was first detected, Norfolk and Kent, plus Suffolk and Surrey as additional counties that had cases due to tracings. The last case was confirmed on the 8th of March. However, we never detected clinical signs in any of these cases. They were considered to have been historical cases. So the outbreak was resolved with just TC sets. The low vector period was quite short, from the 8th of January until the 18th of March. The TC sets were lifted on the 19th of February. Next slide, please. 2024-2025 outbreak. If you remember, there was more faster and more extensive spread of the disease in the Netherlands, and we detected the first confirmed case on the 26th of August. The tracing window was considered to start on the 28th of July, and we ended up having 265 cases with nearly 1,000 positive animals, over 800 in cattle, but much more spread than last time. 28 counties, including 2 in Wales that were due to tracings. The initial TC sets, both in Norfolk and the East Riding of Yorkshire, plus a very short-lived one in Kent, were extended very quickly into R sets, which progressively was extended and covering the whole of England as of the 1st of July, as you know. So we detected a BTV12 case as a result of a winter surveillance that we did to detect serotypes other than 3 as a result of incursions from the near continent. Big change this time around, and clinical signs seen, including a very severe clinical signs, including dummy calves, etc., abortions, resorptions, etc. The virus circulation was proven continued, and we continue to have cases beyond the end of the seasonal vector load period on the 22nd of March. In fact, the last case was on the 30th of May. Next slide, Christina. In terms of what this season has brought, we detected the first case on the 10th of July in Herefordshire, not an incursion area. The tracing window was deemed to be the 14th of May, which was the earliest day the extrinsic incubation period could have been completed, and that was in the London area. But bear in mind, the animals had moved from Hertfordshire quite recently. It was precautionary sound to select that date. So far, well, we have 12 cases, so we keep having them now affecting 14 animals. The vast majority of them, 9 now, are clinical cases in sheep. And the cases detected via active surveillance, 2 pre-movement test and private test were in cattle. Some of the sheep, although in small numbers, have been very severely affected. In fact, 2 have died. 1 was euthanized, and a little lamb detected a few days ago is likely to be euthanized as well. And I've mentioned now that we start with an RSET covering the whole of England. I will hand you back to Christina to dwell more into the clinical picture that we have seen.
Thanks, Pilar. So clinical picture in GB. So as Pilar has said, during the 2023 season, none of the confirmed cases reported clinical signs. Also, disease was detected during the winter, so we wouldn't expect to see necessarily clinical signs. But this changed during the 2024-2025 season, where at the beginning of the season, so late August, September, most cases were identified by report cases from either the farmer or the private vets. And then we saw a spike in report cases from January onwards, but in this case, those ones were linked to dummy calves, stillbirths, abortions, instead of clinical signs in adults, so what we would expect for the winter period. So this season, we have started to see clinical signs in early July, so much earlier than last year. And as Pilar has said, sheep in this occasion seems to be severely affected. So what we like to use for Bluetongue is fever, face, and feet. So if you have conditions or lesions affecting these areas, that would raise suspicion of Bluetongue. And these are the most typical clinical signs we saw out in the field last year. So malaise and lameness were the 2 most common clinical signs for cattle, and nasal discharge and malaise were the 2 most common clinical signs, for sheep. Other common signs that we have seen across both cattle and sheep have been ulcerations, crusting, conjunctivitis, coronitis, high temperature, and hypersalivation. And here we can see some of the pictures taken from vets attending sheep report cases. So as you can see, very similar picture to what we have seen earlier. A lot of the sheep are moribund, flat out. They are not very happy. They are reluctant to move, to get up, and we also have the crusting and discharge around the nostrils down towards the mouth, and also heavy salivation in some cases, and also erosions on the mouth and some on the dental pads as well. In the cattle, we can see again similar clinical signs. So we can see reddening of the surface of the nose, crusty material again in the nostrils, and cracking starting in some cases. In this case, you can also see some erosions, maybe not that clear because the pictures are not that big, but you can see erosions on the teeth, quite sore, inflammation around the coronary band as well, which can be very tender and hot when you touch it. And as a result, obviously, animals don't like moving around and they are lame. That can be in 1 or more feet. And also more erosions within the gum and the mouth. So in January 2025, it was the first time that we had evidences of reproductive issues linked to Bluetongue 3. And since then, we've had 23 calves with brain lesions, and 19 of these were confirmed for Bluetongue. The other ones were not tested, unfortunately. So this herd, some also reported other reproductive issues, such as poor fertility, abortions, red noses, cataracts, and swollen joints, as you can see in these pictures. So dummy calves were born and they were weak, unable to suck. We will see a couple of videos now. Post-mortem identified in most cases hydranencephaly, so the fluid-filled cavities within the brain. And here you can see some of the videos. So you can see blindness and reduced awareness in general. That's quite clear there. In the second one, you can clearly see the stag grazing one. And then white base, the stance and change of gait. And the third one. Okay, so since this was the first time that we found reproductive issues linked to Bluetongue, we were granted permission to study 5 herds in greater depth, and we conducted whole herd sampling in 5 different herds in the all of them in the high-risk area of England. And in this slide, you can see the main features for each herd. It's a very packed slide. So I will mention some of the main things. So apart from herd 5, disease was confirmed in the other herds between mid-January and early March, and these were all linked to primarily to dummy calves showing neurological signs and brain lesions. In herd 5, it was different. So disease was first confirmed back in November following a pre-movement test, and then in March, the vet tested 4 cows that had shown an abrupt drop in milk productions, having already ruled out other diseases. So one of the 4 cows came back positive for Bluetongue, and we decided to do some more investigations in this herd. So all the 5 herds reported abortions during the autumn before Bluetongue disease was confirmed in these herds. Herds 1 to 3 are beef suckler herds between 50 to 100 cattle each, usually calving winter or springtime, breeding with their own bulls and weaning calves naturally. Herds 4 and 5 are dairy herds, with herd 5 housing over 1,000 cattle and relying mainly on artificial insemination, and then feeding milk replacer after colostrum from the dam. So in terms of disease monitoring, just to highlight that in herd 5, there seems to be an outbreak of neospora, so which seems to be the main reasons for the abortion and the milk drop issues. So Bluetongue is likely to be a concurrent factor. For herd 5, unfortunately, because it was over 1,000 cattle, we only did statistical sampling, selecting random animals across each group, so not all observed reproductive events can be conclusively linked to Bluetongue. So at the bottom, we can see the results and the total number of positives. And as you can see, there is a big variation between groups from 28% to 98% of animals positive. Important to note that herd 1 and 2 vaccinated for Bluetongue after we took the sample, so there is no interference of the vaccine with those results. Herd 3 vaccinated in October, and we sampled in March, and we still found the reproductive issues. So it's likely, when you put the whole picture together, it's likely the herd got infected before it was vaccinated, unfortunately. Herds 4 and 5, they were vaccinated for Bluetongue only a few days before We did the on-farm sampling, so some of the positives might be linked to this, but we think that is mostly from infection, natural infection. So at the bottom we can also see the percentage of animals of the affected cows within the affected groups that had reproductive issues. Again, quite variable results, but I would like to point out, for example, hair-free, where we have got a lower number of positives, but still of these ones, we have got 60% had reproductive issues. So this reminds us of the impact and how destructive the virus can be. And also important to note that in her one, the bull failed a fertility test. So over to Pilar and Richard to comment on the disease control response.
Thank you. And Jim alluded to the EU legislative basis based on the animal health law. We are out of sync with our assimilated legislation in GB, as you know. However, the exotic regs were amended in April 2024, and the second season of Bluetongue 3 was dealt with under a new disease control framework, which added flexibility, and I will get into that. That was specific for England in 2024. Next slide, please. So at the moment, we undertake passive surveillance. However, since the 1st of July, APHA is not attending report cases in the RSET, which is the whole of England. However, DEFRA will pay for up to 3 animal tests from those cases. We continue to have enhanced passive surveillance based on abortion suspicion, and we do routine horizon scanning, and you can see information from the team on open in the website. Movement controls are in place, as you know, as they are internally within GB. So pre-movement testing is required for germinal products and for movement to the devolved administrations, meaning Scotland and Wales. We carry out regular airborne orbivirus risk of incursion assessment, which includes elements of horizon scanning, midge trapping, temperature assessment, and mainly atmospheric dispersion modeling from the name model. As you know, in Northern Ireland, we have this risk-based active surveillance in the slaughterhouse, and the main control measure for Bluetongue, as you know, vaccination. However, we seem to have relatively slow uptake. Next slide, please. Surveillance was done reactively. The objective of the surveillance was to assess whether the current extent of the restrictions was correct, not to determine what was the prevalence in the restricted zones. Next slide, Christina. So this comes from this legislative amendment, first in England in April and in Wales in September, to the exotic regs, which essentially changed what was a must in the previous legislation to what is a may. So the first cases were meant to be dealt with zones of different size, 20k zones if they were areas of incursion, or 50k zones if they were areas of subsequent spread. Next slide, please. I think maybe a digital animation. So we could either choose, if we didn't find that pattern and the situation was more severe to start with, obviously we could set up the traditional bigger areas, but we had this flexibility, which is what we started using. So I mentioned these 2 zones, but given that over 90% of the spread is around the 20k zone, thanks to the modeling work from the Pirbright Institute, statistical sampling was meant to happen on the first 20k radius of any zone, whether it was a 20 or a 50k. Obviously, there were movement restrictions, but pre-movement and any required post-movement test was paid by DEFRA and booked through veterinary delivery partners until the 1st of July. So, as I said, the main objective of the surveillance is to determine whether the current extent of the restricted zones was correct. So only cattle holdings had a single PCR round. And we know because of this preference that Christina alluded to for cattle, and we have seen that a majority of positive animals were cattle. We also know that we can rely on passive surveillance more reliably in sheep that tend to have more severe clinical signs than in cattle. When we designed this statistical sampling strategy in the zones, we were showing between different values based on modeling and previous outbreak values. We chose a 5% between herd prevalence and a 4% within herd prevalence for our sampling, which gives really a 0.2 prevalence at animal level, which is way below the 1% required for freedom under the EU law. So we had our first TC set on the 26th of August in Norfolk, as I said before. So the plan was to sample 79 holdings with 35 cattle per holding in this 20K zone radius. However, that didn't last long, and within a couple of days we had 3 overlapping TC sets, and before we could think about how to tackle those, we had our first R set 2 days later, covering the counties of Norfolk and Suffolk. So our priority went straight to the edges of that zone to see if they were appropriate to contain the zone. We looked at the surface area, and really there was a phase 1 of sampling on the 0 to 5K inner boundary, and hoping for negative results there, the plan was to statistically sample on the 5 to 10K area subsequently. And those roughly covered the same surface as a 220K zone. So we set out to sample initially in the southernmost edge of the 0 to 5K inner boundary, just to start checking the border. However, we kept picking up positives and also report cases near the border. So that zone didn't last long either. In fact, in terms of surveillance, positive cases due to surveillance in the 0 to 5K zone were picked up in each of the extensions that we had, and we had many. So those, if they were too close, less than 20K radius from the border, will trigger an extension, same as any other positives. And this was just really playing catch up. So you can see how the situation unraveled. We didn't do any surveillance as a result of the last extension to the case in Lancashire, but that kind of tipped the balance towards extension in the whole of England. And Richard will talk more about that case later on. Next slide, please. So overall, the surveillance cases were, nearly a quarter. However, this was only a statistical sampling, not blanket surveillance in the TC set like in the first season. And it was just limited to the 0 to 5K inner boundary with a single round of PCR testing. And you can see how other streams contribute to the positives as they were kicked in. So initially report cases, typically rams kept by retired vets, if you remember. And then surveillance started to pick up cases as it was implemented, followed by movement cases, and then some positives from the winter surveillance. The last farms in Kent were recruited because the farmer requested a pre-movement test. That's why some of those had, one actually had a dual purpose, and those picked up additional positives plus the BTV 12. Next slide, please. I'll hand over to Richard to talk about tracings now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Pilar. So this first slide is just a summary of the number of tracings that we did through the 24-25 season. So an awful lot of tracings done. We'll talk about the methodology shortly, and then we can see some of the cases on there. So in terms of for both the previous seasons, 23-24 and then 24-25, our principles for tracing have been susceptible species moved from premises where we know there are confirmed cases. And then we subsequently extended that to movements from premises considered to be at a higher risk, i.e. they were within a temporary control zone or the restricted zone. So we loosely call them zonal tracings. And we also had a concept of what we call intermediate premises, which again I'll talk about shortly. We can see the tracing windows Pilar's already mentioned for the first two seasons, 23, 24, 24, 25. They were based on the estimated dates of incursion of wind-borne infected midges from the continent. And then for the current season, again, Pilar's mentioned it, but we were looking at the earliest date from the work that APHA do with the Met Office and Pirbright. We can see here the figures on the right-hand side. They're looking at cumulative degree days. So that's the number of cumulative days where temperatures have exceeded the 13.2 degrees centigrade threshold for a midge to be able to complete its EIP. So we can see there the darker the colour, well, once they get up into the black, that they've basically passed that point. So as mentioned, 14th of May was chosen on a precautionary basis. Those thresholds were predominantly achieved in central London, but other areas were very close to those. So we took that date as a precautionary onset. Next slide, please. So looking at what we call intermediate premises, so if we're tracing animals from an infected premises, fairly straight, they move to their new premises. If they're all still there, we can test them all, and then they're either positive or negative. We have an answer. The problem we were facing with a lot of these and with delays in the time of tracing, because we were tracing animals as the zones got larger, and obviously we found more positive animals in other areas that triggered a zone extension. They could have been infected quite a bit earlier. So a lot of these movements had taken place before we knew there was disease in that area. Some of those had gone on to their next premises, and not all of them were there to be able to be tested to give us reassurance that disease had not spread, predominantly that they may have died on farm or they may have moved to an abattoir, been slaughtered, not available for sampling. So initially with those, we were having to consult with policy on a case-by-case basis, how they wanted us to handle those, depending on what we thought the risk of disease having been spread to that intermediate premises was. If we can move on. And that was obviously causing delays in the decision making, and potentially farmers affected could be under restrictions longer than they perhaps needed to be. So the field epidemiology team, working with disease experts at Pirbright, we came up with what we call the intermediate premises assessment tool. It's essentially a rapid risk assessment methodology we could use to assess the likely risk of disease on these premises where not all the traced animals were available for testing. So whether some of those animals that had moved off, whether they could have taken disease there and then they were no longer there to be tested. So in all of these cases, we started with the assumption that there was, can we go back, please? We started with the assumption that there was a high risk of disease spread. So we were looking at a number of different factors on the premises. So the likelihood that the animals that had moved off could have been infected where they were. So basically, essentially, when did they move? How long had they been potentially at risk of disease on that premises? Sampling dates on the affected premises, the species numbers of positives, proportion of the traced animals that moved on that were available for sampling, whether it was high or most of them had already gone, or in some cases none of them were left. Again, factoring in whether any of those traced animals could have been pregnant. So we've heard about the risk of transplacental transmission in pregnant animals. If they're infected late in gestation, they can give birth to calves which may be viable and alive, but they can still be potentially viremic. And then similarly, we know the potential risks from entire male animals intended for breeding. So that would all be factored in. Then once we look at the premises they went to, looking at the risk that they could have been bitten by a infected and infectious a local midge could have bitten a potentially infected and infectious traced animal. So again, the date those animals moved on, the number of days they're at the premises. In some cases, we had animals moved, for example, to an approved finishing unit and then direct to slaughter. They were only there for a couple of days, so much less risk. Then looking at the likelihood that those vectors could then have become competent to complete their extrinsic incubation period and thus be able to transmit onwards to resident animals. So again, looking at the how close we were to the seasonal vector low period and looking at temperature data at that premises, looking at those numbers of days over the minimum average of the 13.2. And then finally looking at the background risk at the intermediate premises. So were they far away, an area where we hadn't seen any disease, or were they in a county that was very close, bordering a higher risk zone, so potentially less of a risk of a long distance jump? Then we come to an overall assessment and recommendations, if we can move on. How we got there. So a rapid one, we would look at the destination using postcode essentially of that intermediate premises, look at when the animals arrived, the amount of time they'd been there and the amount of time up until the seasonal vector low period. So we get the average temperature data from an app such as this, and then we'd put that all together, bearing in mind, as has been mentioned, it can take 26 days at an average of 15 degrees centigrade for a midge to complete that EIP. We can look in a case like this, we've got way beyond 26 days. The average temperatures are fairly high, barely dipping between 14 degrees essentially. So in this case, that would be fairly easy to say we thought there was a risk and we wanted to do more investigation on that premises. Next slide. For those where there was some degree of doubt, so depending on the time of year and the location, particularly if they're in a more northerly, generally cooler area, again, we'd go to experts at Pirbright. They would do some modelling. We can see the figure on the bottom left, looking at average temperatures over the last several years. We can see the horizontal line in the grey, which is this 13-degree threshold, and the amount of time over that's elapsed. And looking at that, they can predict whether, given the temperatures and times of the year that we were interested in and the times the animals were there, whether or not local naive midges could have completed that EIP had one of the animals been infectious and they'd bitten it. If we can move on. So overall, we come up with conclusions and recommendations. So if we thought it was a relatively low risk, we were happy to lift restrictions and no further actions. If there was deemed to be a higher risk of that, we would potentially then sample. If it was a small premises, we'd potentially sample everything, certainly everything in the group that those animals had been in, or everything on the premises. If it was a small premises, midges could have been flying easily around. Or we may, in some cases, if there was doubt, we'd add a precautionary 7 days onto that EIP to allow for detection by PCR were we to sample if it was a marginal case. So that allowed the decision to come back across to us more operationally and speeded the whole process up. We also extended that process latterly to premises where we found we detected positive animals as a result of tracing, and the same principles applied whether we needed to do much more investigation at those sites. Looking at the outcomes just for 23-24, there was 35 intermediate premises and about 23 others, with some with positive animals that we assessed. From those, we managed to prevent or avoid having to sample almost 17,000 animals. On the ones we did assess as a higher risk, we then did detect further positives. So it seemed that the tool was differentiating and working. Overall, it was it's a balance of probabilities using as much evidence as we could, epidemiological and temperature data, and essentially a large saving of resource to both the field staff and the lab. For last season, for the animals we've traced here, we can see the map here without all the other noise taken off. So these are all positive animals detected as a result of tracings. So we came up with a total of 40 animals positive on 22 different premises. Again, not surprisingly, more cattle than sheep. 4 of those as a result of tracings from actual confirmed premises that had cases. 1 of those was a result of a post-movement test, so a negative pre-movement test. The animal had moved out, was tested positive shortly after, and was found to be positive then. So that had been right on the cusp of detection before it moved. And then 17 premises overall as a result of these higher risk zonal tracings, as mentioned, that hadn't necessarily come from a farm with the confirmed case, but they'd come from that general area. And obviously the numbers of those, as the zone kept extending, there were more and more of those to trace. And to note, 10 of those came from a single source. It was a sheep dealer in Suffolk. Those animals had moved to quite a number of different locations before they came into the zone. We followed them up and found those. Crucially, on all these other premises, we've done additional sampling and not found any evidence of spread. So as well as the work Pilar was talking about in terms of assessing whether the RZ boundary is in the right place, the tracings also helped augment that as well. Next slide, please. And then so far, obviously now, as of 1st of July, as been mentioned, all of England's now an RZ, so we're not tracing animals within England, but we are tracing them if they move to either Scotland or Wales prior to the 1st of July, after which they would have had to have been pre-movement tested, or more latterly, they can take, certain cattle can take exemption of vaccination if they use a certain vaccine. So there's a small number in Wales so far. And that is me. Thank you.
I'll just very quickly give some key information about vaccination. How is it going, basically? As you know, there are 3 Bluetongue 3 vaccines that have received emergency marketing authorization based on a limited assessment of quality, safety, or efficacy. And more studies with additional evidence are expected. So in terms of the coverage overall, without distinguishing by vaccines, next slide, please, Christina. The top counties for cattle is a whooping South Glamorgan with 52% of the cattle vaccinated there. And that's very much an outlier. The next one, it's Cheshire with 22.66%, followed by Pebbleshire in Scotland with similar figure of coverage of 17.61. Lower coverage for sheep at county level. And the top 3 counties, Dorset, Wiltshire, and West Sussex, are around 10% coverage. That's what I wanted to say about vaccination, given the time we had today. Thank you. We have to thank a huge number of people that had contributed to this work, farmers and private veterinary surgeons, APHA field delivery team, APHA veterinary investigation centers and the surveillance intelligence unit, disease consultants at the Purbright Institute, the NIC, wider NIC, including other collaborators like the International Disease Monitoring Unit, etc., DEFRA Exotics Policy Team and the UK CDO, a GIS team, the Outbreak Central Services teams, and the University of Surrey. And this is the end of our presentation, and I don't know how things are going to develop.
I can pick it up from here. Thanks very much, colleagues. Very interesting, a lot of information. I'll ask Kathy to start sharing ours, but we'll pick off some quick questions while Kathy is sharing the DARE presentation. Who's first of all, for all colleagues on the call, I think we have to note and be appreciative of the valiant efforts that have been taken right across GB over the last couple of outbreak seasons. Whilst the RZ crept further westwards, it was at a slowish pace, and that is down to the efforts of our colleagues in APHA and DEFRA, and Obviously, Scotland, Wales, the Republic of Ireland, and notably ourselves have benefited from that. I'll ask a couple of quick questions, and then I've got one quick question as well too. So, have there been any reports in alpacas being affected with bluetongues? I think they are a susceptible species, but has there been any reports recently? I don't know who's best to pick that up, from Richard or Christina or Pilar.
Non-confirmed. In the last season, we had the odd, not many report cases, but they were all negated. And yes, the camelids are susceptible species. So the positives have been restricted to cattle and sheep, not even goats. We have found positives.
Okay, and maybe one for Richard. Again, can degree data be used to calculate EIP?
Yes, that's what the Pirbright Institute do when we go to them. And some of those complicated graphs there that I showed you, they'll come up with a conclusion and tell us, yes, we think they could have completed in this time window, and that would then inform us that we'd go and do more sampling to be reassured that they hadn't taken disease further afield.
And I have a silly question just myself as well, actually, while I was sitting here thinking, can it be too warm?
Well, as Christina said, it is all time temperature dependent. So the EIP will be much shorter at very high temperatures. So it can be as short as 4 or 5 days in some cases. But the flip side is, so you can have more midges more rapidly becoming competent to spread, but they don't live as long, as Christina mentioned. They don't like if you get up to 30 degrees or above average, it's not particularly favourable. They won't live quite as long, but they will live longer in the winter, conversely, albeit they take longer to get to that stage of being infectious.
And then one last one as well too, then, and I think this is one of the $6 million questions as well too, is any evidence now in respect of why the clinical picture in GB has been different to some parts of mainland Europe? I know we've been asking that of ourselves often.
I think so. Fortunately, last season we saw most cases in the eastern parts of the country, where all cattle and sheep density is lower. So we expect that to change as the virus circulates in other areas with higher density of cattle and sheep. So there is more chances for them more cycles to complete, and more animals to get infected and so on. So,
and I think the addition to that is has already been mentioned, that we've detected active disease earlier this year, so we've got a longer risk window, longer time that transmission could occur. So
more chances for the midges to complete the temperature cycle, as the temperatures have been warmer. So all of that influences in the amount of virus circulating around and the clinical picture.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember, incursions detected in November led to 65 cases. Incursions detected at the end of August led to 265 cases. And we have picked the first ones that were confirmed on the 10th of July. So I don't know it's around the corner.
Okay, I see Kevin McCarthy, I know has got his hand up. Kevin, if you could pop any questions in the chat, it would be much appreciated. You can access the chat, the Q&A. You can access the Q&A from the Q&A tab at the top, and we'll address questions as we move through. Well, thanks, colleagues. Hopefully you can stay for a little while and maybe help us answer some questions as they arise. But I'd like to thank you for that very informative presentation. I'm going to hand over to Maria now, from Maria O'Hagan from our veterinary epidemiology team within DAERA, who's going to talk a little bit about BTV3 risk to Northern Ireland. Hopefully you're there, Maria.
Yes, I am. Chair, thank you very much. I just wanted to say a few words about risk pathways for bluetongue virus into Northern Ireland. So there's a number of routes that an incursion could potentially happen. So the first one would be via importing an infectious animal, but it has to be noted that there hasn't been any legal imports of cattle, sheep or goats from GB or mainland Europe in 2025. Incursion can also take place via importation of bovine semen, as was mentioned before, and this continues to be a subject of risk mitigation measures at the moment. So these mitigation measures include that there should be no clinical signs of bluetongue in the bull, that the bull should be kept for at least 60 days outside a restricted zone or in a seasonally free, vector-free area or protected from vectors. In addition, the bull might also be subjected to diagnostic testing. The third option then would be that incursion is possible via passive dispersal of midges in vehicles, but this is unlikely given that they are usually attracted by specific volatile cues such as rotten materials, and most vehicles don't possess that. And lastly, which is the most likely one at this point, I suppose, is via infectious midges that are being blown across from GB or mainland Europe. And at the moment, as I say, that's the most likely incursion. Next slide, please. So to try to closely monitor that, we do some horizon scanning, and we do that in 3 different ways. First of all, midge traps, and these are run by AFBI, and they determine whether we're in the active midge season or not. Secondly, then hazard management, that was already shown a little bit earlier. It's produced by the Met Office, and it determines when the wind direction and strength are sufficient to blow infectious midges across to Ireland from GB. And then lastly, the cumulative degree days, and that's produced by APHA, and that determines when the temperature is high enough for the virus to complete its extrinsic incubation period, as mentioned before. Next slide, please. So these then are the locations of the midge traps that AFBI has placed throughout Northern Ireland. So they're in 7 different places, and they are there when preparing for the vector active season to start and when to end. This year, midges have been active since April 2025, and it's based, usually this activity is based on finding 5 or more Paris female Culicoides midges being caught in one of the traps. Next slide, please. So secondly then, as mentioned before, there's the hazard management system. So these are maps produced by the Met Office, and they run twice daily. Those maps are run twice daily. So at dawn and at dusk, which are the times that the midges are most active. It previously only modelled what happened at 2 locations, in Liverpool and Ayr, but now, as you can see, there's other locations as well. 2 new ones in Holyhead and Workington have been added. So that gives a little bit of better coverage of what is happening at different coastal locations. The main location of interest for us in Northern Ireland is the northeast coast of England, as there has been positive bluetongue cases in homebred animals, for example, in Lancaster. Winds have been mostly westerly, thankfully, and reflecting a fairly low risk, with the last easterly wind now dating back to the 20th of July. But of course, that can change any time. Next slide, please. So lastly then, as was mentioned before, the cumulative degree days, that's based on maps produced by APHA. So for midges to become infectious, as mentioned before, the virus must undergo temperature-dependent transformations, and work at Per Bright Lab predicts that it requires about 50.7 degree days. So APHA circulate a weekly map with the cumulative degree days based on the sum of how much the mean daily temperature exceeds 13.2 degrees over a given time period. So it predicts when the temperature has reached the threshold required for the virus to complete its extrinsic incubation period. And unfortunately, this threshold was already surpassed for most of Northern Ireland on the 24th of June this year. And then the last slide, please. So a little bit about the risk assessment then. We update our risk assessment on a regular basis. It's based on the following factors, as you can see on the slide. So the number and geographic extent of cases in England, the circulation of bluetongue virus in the midge population in England, the proximity of cases, considered to be due to active midge circulation, and especially, as I said before, in the northwest coast. the extension of the restricted zone to cover all of England from the 1st of July, and the inability to prevent passive dispersal from GB to Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland. The likelihood of an incursion at the moment, considered on all these factors, is medium, but the impact of an incursion to be considered to be moderate. But the overall risk considered moderate with high uncertainty. That's due to the inability to predict weather patterns and midge dispersal. However, at the moment, that's we're considering to put that up to high. But again, the situation is very dynamic, so we constantly, keep an eye on it and monitor that. And that's me, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Maria. I guess we'll run through our approach in respect of assessing the risk and some of the tools that are used. And again, thanks to colleagues both in APHA but also in DAFM as well, as we're working across the islands in respect of some of these tools. I'm going to bring in Ignatius McKeown now. He's going to talk a little bit about our BTV3 disease control approach. As said at the start of this meeting, given that BTV is a Category C disease, we've worked closely with a wide range of stakeholders in respect to these measures. I would also caveat this with, and I'm sure Ignatius will touch on as well, this is our initial starting point. I think we would be naive to believe that this would be where we end up. I think this disease has been demonstrated by colleagues in GB, will test our ability to flex and adapt as we move through any outbreak. But it's important to understand where our starting point is, so that you as stakeholders through your representative organisations can ensure that any measures that we're taking, that we're aware of the impact of them and that we continue to provide benefit that's proportionate for any measure that we take. But I'll stop there and hand over to Ignatius now to take us through the next few slides. Thanks, Ignatius.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. Good evening, everybody. There's never been an outbreak of bluetongue in Northern Ireland in indigenous cattle. The last time bluetongue was detected in Northern Ireland was in an imported heifer from France back in December 2018. And again, this was found as part of our post-import controls, where all animals from risk areas were tested, both serologically and PCR. Bluetongue is a notifiable disease, and if the disease is suspected by a farmer or by a vet, they have responsibility to report that data. The reporting can be done either via the PVP or by contacting DAERA Direct or the local DVOs or the DAERA helpline on 0300 200 7840. Next slide, please. At the moment, DAERA carries out active surveillance via abattoir sampling, as Pilar has already mentioned. And again, that is two functions. The first function is to basically to declare disease freedom and to provide assurance that we are indeed free. And the other is that potentially it may expose positive cases if they're already present. Post-import testing up until fairly recently has been extended to include all risk animals imported from affected countries. But since the onset of BTV3, the number of imported animals coming into Northern Ireland from mainland Europe and from GB has basically ceased. As Maria has already said, surveillance also includes midge traps, which are used to determine the vector active period, assess the risk of transmission in case there is a disease incursion. And again, if we received any reports of suspect cases, an investigation will be carried out by DAERA veterinary staff. Next slide, please, Kathy. At the moment, Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland do not currently permit animals to be imported from BTV affected areas in the EU unless they satisfy the requirements of the Animal Health Certificate. In practical terms, if BTV3 is in the area, basically animals cannot be imported from those particular areas. That includes mainland Europe and also includes GB as well. So the imports of all live ruminants and camelids from GB to Northern Ireland has ceased since the onset of BTV3 and GB. At that particular time, we carried out an exercise where all animals imported from the 1st of September from GB until the time of the infection was reported were tested in Northern Ireland, and thankfully all were negative at that particular stage. The import of general products is permitted to continue, provided again they satisfy the requirements of the export health certificate, which basically controls, and again, as already been mentioned, controls the risks from bulls and potentially infected bulls as well. Sheep semen is also under the same rules and conditions. Not all of mainland Europe is restricted because of bluetongue, and there is a potential for animals from non-restricted areas of mainland Europe to come to Northern Ireland, and again, potentially they can actually go through GB. But having said that, they will have to carry out risk mitigation control measures during transport. And again, this is mainly, well, the first thing is the vehicles have to be properly cleansed and disinfected before loading. They have to be treated with insecticide as well. And again, this is to control the risks of moving ruminants through an infected area. Next slide, please, Kathy. We'll now move on to what will happen if we do get a disease outbreak in Northern Ireland. Next slide, please. So this is going to come to our notice in two main ways. As I said earlier on, potentially it will come to our notice via the abattoir survey, where a positive animal is found at AFBI, or alternatively by a suspect case reported by a PVP or a flock keeper or herd keeper. A veterinary investigation is undertaken, and if the disease can't be ruled out, samples will be taken. A PCR test for virus detection and serology for antibody detection will be carried out at AFBI. The premises in question will be restricted at that particular time. If the sample is negative, the restrictions will be lifted. If we go on to the next slide, please. However, unfortunately, if the samples are positive, an infected premises will be declared, and we will notify the authorities in GB and the ROI. If we have a positive PCR animal from AFBI, the samples also have to be sent to the EU and UK reference laboratories, again for confirmation. Once we get a positive PCR positive from AFBI, well then temporary control zone of 20 kilometres will be put in place. Again, this is a restriction zone, and again, the movements of animals into and out of the zone will be controlled. We will sample all the susceptible animals on the infected premises, and we will consider the culling of infected animals at that particular time. Again, there are a lot of things to think about, but certainly we consider that in the initial one or potentially 2 or 3 cases, culling will be seriously considered. Once we move beyond that stage, culling starts to become unlikely. Again, cleansing and disinfection of the affected premises will also need to be taken place as well. Next slide, please. Thanks, Kathy. These are examples of 20-kilometre temporary control zones or control zones in Northern Ireland. Again, you can see from the map there is potential that they can extend across the border, and certainly our approach and DAFM's approach to a disease outbreak will be fairly similar. Okay, next slide, please. In the control zones, well, first of all, if we start off with the infected premises, the restrictions will not allow movements on or off the infected premises. And again, as I say, in the temporary control zone before confirmation, there will be movement restrictions across the zone. However, moves to slaughter within Northern Ireland from the temporary control zone will be permitted under a specific licence. Export moves to slaughter to EU member states will be permitted, and again, there will be a 48-hour pre-notification requirement. Welfare moves out of the TZ and or control zone CZ will be considered on a case-by-case basis and will be carried out using a specific license. Next slide, please. Once we have confirmation of the disease from the EU or the UK reference lab, the CVO will formally confirm the disease. The temporary control zone will be replaced by the control zone. The EU and the World Organization for Animal Health will be notified. And again, our intention will be, if we get an outbreak of Bluetongue, is that we will do our best to become a free area again and hopefully eradicate Bluetongue if at all possible. Surveillance across Northern Ireland will commence towards recovering EU disease status. The main requirements for that is 2 years freedom of Bluetongue cases and also carrying out surveillance at a level of 95% probability at a 1% infection level. So that will give you approximately 300 samples per DVO to satisfy that particular requirement. Movement restrictions across the control zone will continue. Okay, next slide, please. The active surveillance within the temporary control zone and the control zone, the main function of the active surveillance is basically to see how much Bluetongue is there within the zone. To do that, basically we will sample 19 large cattle herds up to a max of 175 cattle per herd. And again, as I say, these will be spread throughout the control zone. And as I say, the function of that is to determine is there only one case in the temporary control zone, or statistically are there more cases within the zone. The herds that are selected for sampling, we will be carrying out PCR and serology testing. As I said previously, PCR is for virus detection, and serology basically is for antibody detection to determine whether these animals, whether there's any animals within the herd, have antibodies to Bluetongue and have been previously infected. The herds will be randomly selected with the potential. We will look at the epidemiological picture and consider whether it needs to be a bias, such as wind direction or whatever it is at that particular time. We will also consider whether we need to carry out further sampling at that particular time. Okay, next slide, please. Obviously, a restriction zone of 20 kilometres will have major implications both for the individual farmers and also for shows and livestock markets during the EPI investigation period. So the agricultural shows will be permitted within the TCZ if no susceptible species are permitted onto the premises. So basically, we can't have shows in the zones, in the restriction zones, basically where there could be the movement of animals, susceptible animals, into or out of the zones. Shows will be permitted outside the restriction zones, and the animals which go to those particular shows can only come from outside the zones. Markets within a restriction zone can operate, but susceptible species will not be permitted to go to that particular market. And again, markets outside the zones can operate, but animals from the restricted zones are not permitted to go to the markets. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. Okay, thanks. That's me, Jim.
Thanks, Ignatius. Folks, there's a few questions in the chat or in the Q&A, sorry. I'm happy for other questions to be popped in there we're coming near the end of our presentations now, so please pop any questions. I do have a quick question here probably. I'll maybe try you, Ignatius. Why are midges that are trapped not being tested for Bluetongue? I don't know whether you would have a answer for that. I think I know the answer. Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say the testing of midges, basically, there's two issues in relation to testing of midges. The definitive test of Bluetongue infection is in a ruminant animal. And again, that's what we need to determine whether we have Bluetongue present. The other thing is the testing of insects, again, is a fairly blunt tool in relation to find disease present. As one of the APHA speakers said, the level of infection within the midges is fairly low. So again, as I say, the potential for finding virus in the midges is also fairly low as well. So those are the reasons, Jim, that we don't test the midges.
I think we could add as well to, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the main purpose of our midge trapping is to determine the start and the start of our vector active period and the end of our vector active period, which becomes important in relation to what disease control approach that we would have. That's an important element of the midge trapping.
Yeah, no, that's correct, Jim.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to vaccination. We'll touch on vaccination. So, so under in the Bluetongue regs, the department has the authority to authorise vaccine use in Northern Ireland. As I've talked about and mentioned by APHA colleagues, there are 3 inactivated BTV3 vaccines that hold authorisations in both the UK and EU, and those are Bluevac 3, Sizewell BTV3, and Bluetongue 3. I think it's important to be clear, that what these vaccines do, but also importantly, what they don't do. So, all vaccines make claims to reduce viremia, which obviously has a positive impact on animal health and welfare, but also a positive impact in reducing the ability to transmit. But it's important to note they don't prevent transmission, and nor do they prevent infection, but they do have a role within a disease control approach. Colleagues in GB have permitted vaccination right across England, Scotland, Wales now, and it's available under general license in those jurisdictions. We'll move on to the next slide, please. I think what was important for us, particularly in discussing with stakeholders right across Northern Ireland and the representative groups, was to understand any impacts that vaccination may have. I'll not touch on the trade impacts now. Eve is going to follow on for me and clarify some of those issues. But what was important for us was that vaccinated animals cannot be used to demonstrate BTV-free status. And as our current freedom is demonstrated by abattoir surveillance, we felt that it was appropriate that we would require specific licenses to vaccinate animals in Northern Ireland at this stage. So there's information on the DAERA website. The farmer must apply to DAERA, filling in some basic information about their flock and herd, if they wish to vaccinate. With some small sense checks, then the department will issue a specific license to a farmer, who will then discuss with their PVP, having already discussed with their PVP the value of vaccinating, depending on a range of factors, which is for the PVP and the farmer to determine the value of vaccination within their flock or herd. It's important that PVPs also require a specific license to obtain, store, or prescribe BTV vaccine, and that's a one-off specific license. This may seem like a arduous process, but I suppose for 2 main reasons, in that we need to be able to identify which animals are vaccinated, and part of that specific license contains reporting elements that farmers are to report to us within a time period, the individual animals that have been vaccinated. That's to ensure that our surveillance can carry on and we can exclude those vaccinated animals from our surveillance, and also to provide some assurance to our colleagues in the ROI who have not taken the decision at this juncture to permit vaccination within the ROI. So move on to the next slide, please. So yes, there's a question mark for farmers, livestock keepers at this juncture. The department and the minister believe that by allowing access to licensed BTV3 vaccine, it gives livestockers the ability to proactively manage their risk in the face of a potential incursion, and that a decision to vaccinate is for the livestock keeper in close collaboration with their PVP. There have been a few questions in the chat around vaccination, and we can maybe address some of them following the trade impacts part of the presentation. But I think one of the principles for the department is that whilst we have permitted vaccination and we'll put a process in place, any decision to vaccinate is for the livestock keeper in close collaboration with their PVP, taking a range of factors into account. And then DAERA will provide the licensing and the ability to record individually vaccinated animals, noting that they're also recording elements on farm as part of normal prescribing and veterinary medicine regulations in respect of that. That's all I was going to say at this juncture. I think we'll move on to Eve. Thanks, Eve.
Oh, thanks, Jim. So yes, good evening, everybody, and thanks for sticking with us. I know there's been a lot of information here. So I just have a few slides where I wanted to go through sort of the impacts on trade of these recently authorised vaccines. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So first of all, I wanted to talk about the situation that we're currently in, which is where Northern Ireland remains Bluetongue free, and what this means for animals that are vaccinated in terms of moves within the EU. So moves to direct slaughter, there is no clause within the certificate and within sort of the EU requirements relating to vaccination. So this means that cattle and sheep that have been vaccinated by one of these recently authorised vaccines can continue to move for direct slaughter to Ireland or elsewhere with no issue. When it comes to animals moving for breeding and production, again, and this is continuing to talk about whilst Northern Ireland remains Bluetongue free, the clause that they can be moved under basically just sort of says that they come from a Bluetongue free area, which Northern Ireland is, and that they've not been vaccinated with a live vaccine. The vaccines that have recently been authorised are all inactivated, so therefore there is no reason why they cannot be used. And again, these animals can therefore continue to move freely within Europe. Next slide, please. Just then wanted to look at sort of germinal products as well, because we know there's a lot of export of that. And again, whilst Northern Ireland remains Bluetongue free, you can just attest movement into the collection centre based on the fact that the animals have been kept within a Bluetongue free area, and vaccination will not have any effect on this sort of at this time. Next slide, please. And just then thinking more about products of animal origin, so thinking about meat and dairy products within the EU, vaccination has no effect on the movement of these products, and actually the same applies if Northern Ireland were to lose Bluetongue free status, that again, meat and dairy products from animals that were vaccinated can continue to be traded. Next slide. So then I just want to think a little bit about if we have a situation where Northern Ireland unfortunately loses Bluetongue freedom, and what this means for any animals that you may have opted to vaccinate now, sort of during the Bluetongue free period, or that you continue to vaccinate after the loss. So again, looking at direct slaughter, the only requirement under EU legislation and within the certificate is that animals cannot be exported from a premises of origin, so a premises that has had an outbreak on the premises itself within the 30 days pre-export. So vaccinated animals can be exported as there's no requirement to attest to vaccination status in the certificate. The other factor that Ignatius touched on earlier is that there is a requirement for pre-notification to the slaughterhouse, that they need to be notified 48 hours in advance of the export, and they also need to commit to slaughtering the animals within 24 hours. When we're talking about animals moving for breeding and production, this is where the vaccine, it's not that it has an effect on it, it's more that it doesn't have an effect on trade under the vaccination clause. So if you're moving from an area that is no longer Bluetongue free, there is an optional clause within the certificate that talks about the movement of vaccinated animals, but this very specifically says that the animals must be vaccinated and still be within the known duration of immunity of that vaccine. Currently, these authorised vaccines do not have a known duration of immunity, so they don't meet the legislative requirements to be classified as vaccinated animals for breeding and production trade. So what this means is any animals that are vaccinated now or after the loss of Bluetongue freedom couldn't be exported under that particular clause. And there is no doubt that restarting the movement of breeding and production animals following sort of the loss of freedom is going to be one of our most difficult sort of challenges. So that is certainly something to be aware of, that vaccinated animals will not automatically be able to be continued to be traded if we lose freedom. Next slide, please. One other thing we just ask people to consider is sort of the movement of germinal products, and advice has been issued to sort of operators of germinal product establishments, which is really just to, if you're considering sort of planning for the potential for an outbreak of Bluetongue and how you might be able to continue to maintain sort of export. For the movement of animals into sort of centres, there is an option to use serological testing at certain intervals, as indicated on the slide, but this relies on there being a negative serological sort of test. So obviously vaccinated animals, there is the chance that they will show up positive. So it's just sort of to bear that in mind when considering your options. But however, this is where PCR can be used. So if you were potentially going to have animals that may be positive because they're vaccinated, you could opt instead to consider PCR. But it's just this requires a little bit of pre-planning and the potential additional costs involved as well. Next slide, please. And then when we come to thinking about third country exports, so that's sort of countries outside of sort of the UK and EU. So some certificates are already unavailable as they require UK freedom. So you may be familiar with Form Finder, which is the UK government website where all certificates are hosted. So if a certificate purely relies on the whole of the UK being Bluetongue free, these will already have been withdrawn. We have collaborated with colleagues in DEFRA to look at certificates that are in active use, and no certificates have been found that preclude the use of vaccination for export. But we'd always caveat that by saying that anyone looking to export, and particularly to export to a new market, it is your responsibility to double check that there's no requirements. But what we would ask is, if you become aware of any issues or possible issues relating to vaccination, please, if you can let us know, because obviously then we can work to see can be anything done to mitigate that, but also to make others aware. And I think that's my last slide, but just next slide just to check. Yep, I think that's at the end. So thanks, Jim.
That's great, Eve. I'm going to start some of the questions then with yourself, saying you're on the screen.
Yep, I'm just having a read. So
no, it's fine. I think it's been covered, but sorry, I know it's been covered, but some confusion. And I think this primarily relates to a DAFM update that's on their website from the 10th of June. And I think the direct quote is, animals vaccinated with the BTV3 vaccine do not currently meet EU standard certificate requirements and cannot be certified for the purposes of movement to Ireland. I think that's a direct quote from that. And that's causing some confusion. I wonder, could you help us clear that up, please? And I think I understand why, but hopefully you can help it clear it up for us now.
Yes. So I believe that this statement was has not yet been updated to reflect the situation where Animals Northern Ireland is vaccinating in the absence of Bluetongue. But this statement would be correct in that animals sort of within GB or anywhere vaccinated with these currently authorised vaccines do not meet the requirements for movement from a non-Bluetongue free area. So it's that clause that I was talking about where you're using the vaccination clause to move if you've lost Bluetongue freedom. And this is because they do not yet have a known duration of immunity. Obviously that may change as time goes on. And also we must also bear in mind that in this case we're talking about BTV3. And again, this is the whole situation may change depending if it's an outbreak with a different serovar, but as far as I'm aware, there are currently no vaccines with a known duration of immunity for any, I think, or maybe is it BTV4? Sorry, Jim, maybe correct me that there's maybe vaccines, basically there are very few BTV variations that have a vaccine currently available with a known duration of immunity, and this is a problem for all EU member states in relation to this particular clause. David, you're asking if you can point us in the direction of that clause in the certificate. Yes, it is certainly, it is within the basically the interest certificate for breeding production for both cattle and sheep, which is available through Traces NT. Sort of, you can actually go on and you can download a blank copy of that certificate.
And happy if anyone wants a copy.
I'm sure we can download and provide.
Contact me or Dara Trade Exports, and you could pop that in as an answer.
I will actually do that now, and then yes, anybody who wants a copy, we can share that. No problem.
I suppose what I would say in summary is that my high-level non-vet summary is that whilst we remain free, vaccination has limited impact on moves to the ROI. Once we lose freedom as a country, there will be impacts for moves anywhere. And that's because the vaccines that are currently being used cannot be used to fulfill the clause in the certificate that permits movement of vaccinated animals, as would be under BTV 8, for example. Is that I think I'm correct in that, Ignatius?
Yeah, that's correct. The main difference between BTV3 vaccines and the other Bluetongue vaccines for BTV8 is that BTV3 doesn't have a duration of immunity, whereas the other vaccines can be used for trade purposes and can be used for insurance, for trade assurances. So that's BTV8 vaccine can be used for trade purposes, but because the testing procedures in relation to BTV3 vaccine haven't been completed, and as Eve says, they can't be used for trade purposes.
Okay, next, while you're on, maybe then another one for yourself. Will we be using PCR tests for any vaccinated animals and ELISA or PCR for unvaccinated animals to ensure that antibodies don't show up on the ELISA and cause false positives? I think that's one of our concerns and why we've probably had our approach in respect of licensing, but I'll maybe ask you to further clarify that. Yeah,
well, the first thing is that's one of the reasons why we were hesitant about introducing and allowing vaccination, because of the effect it can have in surveillance. And it's also one of the other reasons why, if people are using vaccine, we do need to know about it, because vaccinated animals shouldn't be used for surveillance, because of the possibility, yes, they should be serologically positive, but they should be PCR negative. So in those circumstances, whenever we were taking the abattoir samples, we take 2 samples of blood from the animal. We test them all for serology, and if any of them are serology positive, then we test them for PCR to see if there's any virus present. And again, as I say, those circumstances will continue.
Okay, there's another question there which Sandrine has briefly answered in the chat. I don't know, Cindy, whether you're available there. Have any animals been imported from Europe in the last 2 years? And if so, when were the last imports?
Yeah, so just a quick check on traces there. So there were a few up to August 2024. The last ones came from Denmark. There was a few from France and Austria before that. But then it goes back to 2023. So there wasn't very many according to what I can see here. That's
I suppose just
not the ROI, just to include, and that's not coming from the ROI. So anywhere in Europe other than the ROI.
And I suppose at that particular time, those areas were free of Bluetongue, or certainly free of BTV3 at that particular stage.
Okay, I have another question here which I've lost now. Yeah. Yeah, interestingly, I don't know whether maybe some colleagues from GB may be able to comment on this, or other colleagues in DAERA. I think the question is, how long can it be before natural immunity within a flock or herd can bring flock herd health status or production back to normal after BTV3 has been confirmed within that flock or herd? I'm not too sure if there's been many studies done on that yet, or information that we might have available in respect of a flock or herd being able to return to normal production levels after an incursion within the flock. I don't know who's best to. And if the answer is we need to find out more, or Richard, maybe you can help.
Yeah, if I can come into that, it's a huge uncertainty because it depends on the numbers of animals infected. and they obviously have to be infected and recover to gain that natural immunity. But from what we've seen, in most cases, it's been a very low number of animals in most herds. I mean, some of the data on Christina's shows some of the variability, but it's not like they're all getting infected at the same time and becoming immune. So it very much depends on the numbers and the time over which they are, and then potentially in a subsequent year you've got a new naive population of animals coming in. So it's a very difficult question to answer, I think.
Okay. I have another veterinary question here as well too. What percentage of animals show seroconversion on blood sampling after completion of a vaccination program for BTV3? I would probably hope it's quite high, but I don't know what the answer is.
I think that's one we'll have to ask Pirbright, Jim.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't have those figures to hand.
We
It
can-
should
we
be
can-
high, you know,
yeah,
because that's the main evidence that animals have been vaccinated.
We can take that question away.
Sorry, Pilar.
Yeah,
Can
Peter,
you add
sorry.
anything? Yeah.
You're on mute, maybe, Peter? Or we can't hear you. No, sorry. Okay, well, we can come back, sure, if you get yours.
Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, I got rid of the headset. One of the conditions for the BTV survey, where we run PCR, is the single round of PCR at the end of season. But in order to avoid any sort of interfering, we didn't go with serology. But we also require no vaccination in the last 8 years because antibodies can be circulating for a long time. 3 years, in fact.
Thank you. One for you, Eve, I think. Can vaccinated animals be exported to the EU for breeding and production?
Yes, funny, I was actually just typing a response, but I can just say it to everybody, that'd be easier. So yes, sort of whilst Northern Ireland remains Bluetongue free, so to clarify, animals vaccinated with these authorised vaccines can continue to be exported. And I say this is again because these are not live vaccines, so therefore it doesn't interfere with anything that needs to be signed on the export certificate. And just, if you like, while I'm on, I saw that there was also a question from John Kennedy saying you state the breeding and further production animals can be exported in the event of Northern Ireland loss of BTV3 free status. Does this only apply to free regions or to all EU regions? And Ignatius, Jim, you can keep me right from the policy one, but this is one, John, where it may be a changing situation. So the likelihood is that in the initial stages, it will apply to all regions, so that once Northern Ireland loses freedom, they would be unable to export for breeding and production to sort of anywhere within the EU. It is possible then eventually to consider putting in what are referred to as derogations to allow movement to regions that may not be free, or basically where you agree to reduce the requirements for movement. But the trouble is, if we agree to do that to move animals out, we also have to agree that we allow people to do that to move animals into us. And because we're in the initial stages, as Jim and others have said, we'd be very much looking at trying to stamp this disease out and to regain Bluetongue freedom as soon as possible. It's unlikely that we would consider those sorts of derogations at the early stages. It may be something that would be considered at a later stage. And again, it's always weighing up that risk of being unable to sort of regain freedom versus obviously the not inconsiderable sort of impact on trade.
And of course, it goes back to my sort of starting point in this as well too, and the term that I need to stop using, but unfortunately for this disease, it depends. I mean, a vaccination or a vaccine with a known duration of immunity then changes the whole playing field altogether. So it does depend, but as we stand, I'd say the answer to that question is yes. It would, as if we were to lose our BTV or BTV freedom through BTV3, then breeding production animals to the EU would cease at that juncture. I think I've covered most questions. I'll have a quick look through. Whilst I'm having a quick look through, so we'll take the opportunity to thank everyone, both for people for attending. I know it's a beautiful sunny evening. I'm on the north coast here in Portrush, and I think we've just seen the last of the sunlight go down. But I'll maybe not keep people much longer. Like, thank you for attending. Might get a chance to maybe step out into the garden or out into the fields for a while as well. To also like to thank our colleagues from APHA, Richard, Pilar, and Christina. It's been very much appreciated that you've taken time today as well too. And also our colleagues in DAERA for presenting. I'd like to thank also my team for facilitating this in the background, particularly Kathy. Kathy has put a lot of work into this along with Jared, and she'll be thankful that it's now over, and she'll breathe a big sigh of relief, and thanks to Kathy and Jared for that. Let's see if there's any one more last question. Was there? Hold on, just bear with me a second. If we become a Bluetongue zone, can we then trade with mainland UK at some point if animals tested PCR Bluetongue free? That's a very good question. We are continuing our conversations with colleagues across GB in respect to this. What I can say at this juncture is, Eve, I mean, keep me right here, there's no decision at this juncture. It is a question that we're actively pursuing. Just today, I was chasing the Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer for England that's responsible for imports to ensure that we could have a further conversation in respect to this. So it's under active consideration, and we will continue to work with our colleagues across GB and Ireland on impacts of an incursion in Northern Ireland.
Yes, I'd have nothing to add to that, Jim. That's exactly right. That ongoing discussion being had. Okay, folks. Again, the recording will be available on our website. We will share a link in due course. I think I've answered all questions, but we'll have a run through as well to make sure that we haven't left any out. If people would like to ask anything after, please email myself or the disease control inbox. We will pick up any questions and find an answer. We'll also publish answers to the questions that we haven't answered on the DAERA website. So again, thanks everyone for attending. Thanks for presenters. And I wish everyone a good evening and a good rest of the week. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye, everybody.